they can keep hopping in and we'll just get started. Thank you so much for being here today. We are so thrilled. This has been one of the silver linings of the pandemic, for me at least, has been these member conversations. And all of our wonderful members who are here, please spread the word and tell other people about these conversations and encourage them to join. It's a great way to connect with the museum and our artists, even when we're closed. And we are anxiously awaiting the opportunity to reopen so you can see Leanne's work in the exhibition She Persists. And I'm going to go a little bit against what we usually do today, and I'm going to show an image from installation that Bob sent me yesterday. And it's beautiful. There are 3 of my favorite works all in a row. So we'll get to that in a minute. But I wanted to introduce our guest artist today. We are so grateful to have you here. Leanne Truong's practice examines social, cultural, and political history, exploring the influences that form belief systems and notions of heritage. Her work has been included in exhibitions at the National Portrait Gallery, the North Carolina Museum of Art, Station Museum of Contemporary Art, the Weatherspoon, and the list goes on and on. We are lucky that we acquired a work of hers that is so powerful, thanks to Cam Compass in 2019. And we're going to talk about that work today, The Peril of Angel's Breath. I have a couple questions I'd like to ask just to get started. So you were born in Vietnam and you immigrated to the United States when you were still quite small. You were only 2 years old, is that right?
Yeah.
And your work often deals with complex issues of identity. Can you talk a little bit about this and what it was like for you as a child growing up in America?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think, my artwork is really responding to this idea that, as a female Asian person living in America, that the representations of female bodies and identities have really been flattened out in art history. In some ways, like the bodies are racialized, and for myself growing up, that really what that means is that growing up, it's interesting how you form your own perception of yourself, but that's not necessarily reflected from people who see you, right? So, I remember growing up watching all of the sitcoms like Brady Bunch, and, I watched Bob Ross, and I just saw myself in these families, in these people on TV, because that's what young kids do, even though I never saw my representation there, right? And so, it really was until I went to college, I guess for myself, that Vietnam was my home country. My parents, I think any immigrant, any refugee family really, when they think about the things that their parents go through, especially if they came here as young kids, it's just amazing. My dad was almost 50 years old when he came to this country with 3 young kids and had to really remake his life. But so that, I think that for myself, I had, I was always having this idea of like straddling this complex identity of being in the diaspora, right? What that meant as an American. And I think what I mean by the racialized bodies is that, in some ways, because we never see, at least growing up, I didn't see myself reflected in sort of this broader American culture. The identity was sort of flattened out, right? So a lot of my practice is really exploring this idea of what it means to create a complex interiority, in a way, like a complex identity that that many people, coming, who were both born in America and not, have in their relationship to a very transcultural and cross-cultural, upbringing and perspective.
You are such a deep thinking and self-aware artist. And I'm just curious, when did you decide that you wanted to be an artist?
Yeah. Yeah, no, well, that's a very good question. I think, so my parents, I was the youngest of 3 kids. My parents were working all the time. So we were really latchkey kids, which I think a lot of Gen Xers are. And So, TV was our companion. Thankfully I had two older siblings. But I watched a lot of Bob Ross. I mean, I have to say, Bob, I started watching Bob Ross when I was 6 years old. My family was, very into academia, and they wanted their kids to succeed and do well in school, as not all, but, a kind of a stereotypical Asian family. But so when I was, but I, my brother and sister were like the perfect straight A students. I was not. I was definitely much more the rebel. And when I was 14, my mother actually signed me up for an evening oil painting class. And I rebelled at first because as a teenager, my response was, "How dare you do something without asking me first?" But then I went to the class and I just fell in love, and I actually did it for 4 years. And I went to college thinking I would become a science major, and I eventually went to painting, and I went into this amazing honors painting program at Humboldt State University. But it was definitely a struggle. Like, my family didn't really support me initially. They wanted me to do something academic, which I think a lot of artists can probably attest to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's one of the things that attracts me so much to your work is that it's just, there's so many layers. You talk about this blended narrative. And so I put some of your own words up on the screen for
Yeah.
everybody to read about the exhibition Mutiny in the Garden, which the Peril of Angel's Breath, it was or is part of this group of paintings that you did. And
Yeah.
I just want to read what you wrote because it's so gorgeous. In Mutiny in the Garden, my painted gestures serve as visual traces to human bodies,
Mhm.
adorned with historic textile designs, and appear to penetrate in and out of the painted surface. Landscapes indicted in violence and tragedy visually fracture with images and icons of civil rights in oil and on silk. I interpret moments and symbols that have shaped racial, cultural, and religious conflict and assimilation in America. Through a type of blended narrative painting, my work refers to the complex cultural histories that mirror the American lens. I love this idea of a blended narrative painting, and how this is reflected even in your choice of materials by interweaving textiles with painting and Asian art and Western art, as well as textiles from around the globe. Can you talk about this exhibition and what your intention was with this group of artworks? What were you exploring and why?
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you so much for all the kind words, Heather. So this work it's Mutiny in the Garden is a series of 5 works, and what I was doing here was essentially responding to Thomas Cole's The Course of Empire, which is also a series of 5 works. And these works, Thomas Cole was an immigrant. He was not an imperialist. He was actually a staunch environmentalist, but he basically was part of and founded the Hudson River Valley School. And these early American landscape paintings became these symbols of American notions of almost, cultural heritage and history. And they really became entwined with manifest destiny. And so even though Thomas Cole was not for manifest destiny, right? And so for me, I was rewriting this in a way to respond to this idea that these art objects have been seen as symbols of cultural history, and in some ways they perpetuate myths of supremacy, and that also enacts legacies of trauma, right? And so in doing so, I really thought a lot about aesthetic in relationship to also painting history, and also the problems and the issues that have risen um, from the depiction of bodies, right? So often in these, so if we think about Orientalist paintings and British imperialist paintings, for instance, and also early American landscape paintings, they will depict non-European people in a way that is submissive or in Orientalism sexualized, right? And so for me, I really wanted to find both in the image that I am creating and also in the materials that I'm using and the philosophies and techniques that I'm using, um, an aesthetic that basically reflects my own experience and my this idea of this complex identity I have that is like American and who has gone through a very Western education, and then being a Vietnamese American, right? And so I decided to go to the worldwide textile trade. So this is, to me, the worldwide textile trade started it with the Silk Roads. And that was a road that connected the Mediterranean and China. And this was the very first place of East-West cultural exchange. So for instance, silks and trade, but also religions. So one of the things I was reading about the Silk Roads, for instance, is that what was it, the depiction of Buddha. So I think that before there was one of the first depictions of Buddha shows Hellenistic robes, and it's because these depictions of the Greek gods were coming to China, and they had to all of a sudden, like, there was this idea that there was a representation of a god that was needed, right? So it's just fascinating. But also the textile trade itself is its own hierarchy of power and trade. So for instance, in the 1800s, French textiles were traded into Africa for slaves. Textiles were painted in China to adorn the bodies of the high elite in Britain and France, for instance, right? And so there's this really interesting representation there. And I decided to leave figural representation because it was so loaded. And so for here in this part, this writing of mine that you exerted from, the gesture is referring to the figure, right? And so, for me, it was really a way, to combine all of these things, these landscapes. These gestures are adorned with textile designs that are historic. So they're from a particular time period and a particular region of the world. And so really what you see in the paintings that is maybe hard to see in this image is that the textile, the gestures, really, they merge together, and sometimes they disappear and they change. And so it was really a way to speak of the complexities of creating a transcultural identity, and the word transcultural comes from Fernando Ortiz, who was a scholar in the 1940s, and it was his idea that that was like creating this intermingling of different peoples and cultures to create a new cultural phenomena where new cultural aesthetics are born.
So I just pulled up, this is the work that's in our collection, The Peril of Angel's Breath. And Anne, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about what attracted you and the acquisitions committee to this work, and to bring it to Camp Compass for a vote for acquisition.
Absolutely, my pleasure to speak to our captivation with Leanne's work overall. We had the good fortune to work with Leanne and to exhibit her work in a group exhibition celebrating your receipt of the North Carolina Artist Fellowship Award. And fortunately, I mean, we have one of the greatest arts councils in the country. And there is a grant stream with the North Carolina Arts Council that awards excellence. It follows the work of artists moving beyond emerging. And for example, said to Leanne, look here, you are reaching so deeply, you're progressing on such a steady trajectory. Here are grant funds. You choose to use exactly how you need to. If it's to pay for studio rent, if it's to buy vintage Obi silks and fabrics, we trust you. We are cheering you on. And so Leanne's work was exhibited in this exhibition along with her colleagues who had also received the grant monies. And I had the good fortune regularly, weekly, to do public tours of your work. And Leanne, the time we spent with your paintings, the dialogue and the wonderment and as Heather mentions, the layers that just begin to be uncovered as you stay in front of your work, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi longer. And then I just find so fascinating. Your work is so visually, texturally beautiful, and dare I say, seductive. And so I cannot not draw closer. And then I find so much more disquieting content. And I love the way, just that alone, how you draw us in and reveal, oh, well, maybe there are other layers to this and other layers to that. And how quickly in society and in culture, we will naturalize processes and conventions so readily. And then they become entrenched for centuries. And you really opened that up. We just had to, we knew you are soaring with your work, your communication, your messaging. And as a painter, I am undone to try to uncover your processes. So with the public, we began to pretend to be before that canvas or that piece of paper to see there's such an immediacy with your process. And I don't think you give yourself many outs. There are not many ways that you have given yourself to, oh, well, that passage might not be working. I'm going to be. And so just the discoveries to try to think of being with you in your studio, there's just no end to the wonderment. And we knew somehow we have an acquisitions fund to collect work by artists who are living and working in North Carolina. And so we went to those funds and approached you with this. And also, of course, we have an acquisitions committee that we took the work before, but we also have an annual giving society that reviewed your work at a dinner where they were allowed X number of votes, and your work eclipsed the others that we had for them to review. And that's the Compass Society that Heather is referring to.
Wow. Thank
We
you.
don't begin to know all the layers and levels of your investigations, deeply philosophically, economically, culturally. And that's what we hope to have centuries of continuing to look at your work with our public. Your mode of production absolutely takes my breath away.
And geez, I mean, thank you so much. That's so
We
kind.
thank you.
And
We
yeah.
thank you. We thank you. So we just want to continue to acquire more of your work.
Yes.
Your context keeps changing.
Yeah.
And I love that you were talking about taking away the figure and that the gesture is the figural reference. And now I'm sure Heather's leading us into glimpses of your current work, which address the figure.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Well, I also want to say, one of the things, Anne, that you brought up too, is that you were bringing up sort of like the process, of being a painter and the act of painting. And when I normally talk about my work, I normally just go to the concept. So if you have any questions about the act of painting and the process of the materials, please do so. I just don't naturally go there, but I'm happy to talk about them too. So.
Well, thank you. And then of course that you're even sewing into the canvas with precious gold threads. And so that's a great reveal as we continue to look at your work and the dynamism of the threads. But as you were talking about earlier, the penetration of we've got the illusion of space, but that push-pull of figuration, figure and ground, and then that you actually penetrate the surface with needle and thread is so brave.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, well, it's a lot of experimentation, and I think for me, this really was about inserting different traditions of painting globally, so I learned as an oil painter And so in here I have, landscape painting. So this is my take on Thomas Cole's Destruction, and this is the Perils of Angel's Breath, which you acquired. And so we have Manzanar internment camp on the bottom, and then there's the bomb cloud from Hiroshima on the top. And so in here, and there's textile designs from Japanese textile designs I've painted on oil, early American, and also Vietnamese. And so, but I'm also painting on the silk, so so there's all different types of painting happening here. Yeah.
Leanne, when I look at your work, it's so lyrical. I think that's the first thing. It is, as Anne said, it's seductive. And I look at it, and the first thing I see is this intense beauty. But then as you look closely, you realize how fierce it is. You are so brave in what you are holding up to the light. And I am so interested in your process in terms of these big complex issues that you're dealing with. What comes first for you?
Yeah.
Do you think about the idea first? Do you do a lot of reading? Like, how does it gestate?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think a lot of my practice, what's really interesting is that, when I was, a younger artist, let's say in undergraduate, in undergrad and grad school, like I really, probably coming from Bob Ross, I was running into these beautiful landscapes, which took me to Thomas Cole, took me to the likes of Jan van Eyck, beautiful Flemish painter. And so if I have variations of my practice on my website, but it is also responding to art history. And so it seems like what I will do was to kind of look and see normally the ideas come from injustices, for instance, that I have observed just through my lens, right? They're not necessarily personal. I mean, they of course are personal, but they are about just injustice in general that I see. So for instance, thinking about maybe 20 years ago, I did work on LGBT families and the idea of the modern family, right? Responding to paintings from Jan van Eyck's, the Arnolfini portrait. So it's reading, so when I think about the textile trade, for instance, I looked into, I forget, there was the global worldwide globe, I think. I'm forgetting. There was an exhibition at the Met, and it was about the worldwide textile trade, right? I'm reading Anne Ling Cheng's Ornamentalism, for instance. But then a lot of it is about thinking about how to dismantle these histories, these canonized painting histories that have come before me, and to also reflect on the traditions that I love, but also critique them, right? And so it's also a lot of experimentation. I think that the things that you're both also responding to is that, there's a lot of research and thought involved, but the painting is really my vehicle for communication. And the painting, like any artist, like any poet, right? The work has to really live for us being visual. For the poet would be words, right? And so, as far as planning these, I would have, let's say, each of these part of Mutiny in the Garden State I definitely had a situation, a narrative that I wanted to speak about. And so I would have like a landscape, right, that I would choose. And so here it would be the Manzanar internment camp. I would have some textile designs that I wanted to work with. And then they had their own color palette. And so from there, I would start off. There was also no way I could sketch because these 5 paintings are really complicated. And so I knew I wanted gestures, textile design, silk painting, landscapes, but I really didn't know how they were going to go on there. So I would have like some things planned, like just references. And then I would start off with the gradation, and I would do these gigantic gestures on them. With like I made a 16-inch brush by like attaching 2 8-inch brushes. and just kind of like choreograph like the gesture that I would do with my body. I'm 5 feet tall, so I would really have to think about it. um, and then I would just then it was, what was really great about the process actually was that I had to respond to what came previously, right? So I would do the gesture and I would think about it, and then it was just really about a dialogue. And the dialogue was also, so it was where the visual dialogue became really ingrained with the intellectual dialogue, right? So I really, so even though some things were thought out, decisions, visual decisions, which also became intellectual decisions, really built upon themselves.
That's amazing. All right.
Yeah.
So I wanted to show everyone this. I have Bob's permission.
Thanks, Bob.
He sent me this yesterday. It's a sneak peek of the exhibition that he's currently hanging. So there it is. There's the Peril of Angel's Breath.
Oh,
Just waiting for all of you to come see her.
yeah. And I just want to say it is so meaningful for me to be alongside these two artists. I, of course, moving to North Carolina 6 years ago, became really enamored. I mean, I knew of Beverly's work, who's on the left, before I came to North Carolina. and the artist on the right, I'm forgetting. I know the work too. Can you remind me of whose it is?
So that's a Wilmington artist named Margie Worthington.
Yeah.
And I told Bob, these are 3 of my favorites in
So,
the whole collection.
It's
Bob,
really wonderful
yeah.
to be among these other 2 artists too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, in the context of She Persists, which She Persists is an exhibition that really is about women, right? It's about who we are as women, what our identity is as women, what we've had to fight against and struggle against as women. It's in celebration of the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And all of these women artists, of course, were up against something, or they're, pushing against something that has to do with identity in their lives and their work. In their communities. And I'm just wondering, as an Asian American female artist, how has your gender, or has it played a role in your life as an artist, or in your work? And we'll look at some images of your new work too.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yes, I mean, that is directly impacted, I think, not just my practice, but also the trajectory of my practice. So, early on when I fell in love with painting, maybe I didn't have sort of like the critical mindset to look at really the canonized art historical body, right? Which really didn't have the likes of my body in it, and so, but early on looking at I go again to like Orientalist paintings, like that's sort of like where, in America, in art history, I saw representations of Asian bodies, right? And so it was naturally where I started to really kind of think about, who I'm studying and why, and how narrow that lens is, and what it means to insert myself into this history, right? Into this conversation. And so I think, but a lot of my decisions come from also responding to that. So for instance, in this body of work, I am not representing a figural body, but I am using textile designs. And so for me, also reading Cheng's book, Ornamentalism, in modern art, ornamental, and also not just in modern art, but in everyday language, ornamental is sort of like shallow and dismissive, right? But there was, she talks about how in the book how modernism really rejected the ornaments, and really came with this really kind of cemented this idea that anything that was ornamental was shallow and not deep, right? That wasn't pure enough. And of course, these ideas are coming from a very narrow lens, and so that is something to consider. Also, in this tradition of being an Asian American woman, there was this really interesting case in early America in the late 1800s that involved a ship that brought 22 Chinese women to the port of San Francisco. And their entry was rejected. And it was rejected because it was called the case of 22 lewd Chinese women. And they basically in San Francisco, they did not want these women to embark because they were called lewd, and the case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. But when you read and Cheng also mentions this in her book, and that's how I know about it. And when they're describing what makes the women lewd, it's all about what they're wearing, right? How underneath their cloak, they are wearing these like silks that are seductive, that are floral and bright, right? And so, that history is really interesting to me. It is also this aesthetic that I grew up with, like growing up, as a Vietnamese American. I mean, we had, the idea of the Asian ornament all over my household, right? And so this is an aesthetic that is really dear and is part of who I am and part of my heritage. I think one of the things as a painter too is that I do look at all painting, and all painting fascinates me, including the mid-century modernists and and the Renaissance artists and all of that, right? The other day I actually attended a talk by Elisa Pichamaran Alexander, who is assistant curator of American art at the Cantor Art Center at Stanford University, and she was talking about the making of an Asian American art history, and she spoke about Bernice Bing, who was this Chinese American artist who lived in San Francisco in the 1950s, but whose work is just really being recognized now. And so for myself as a painter, I mean, I remember when I'm looking forward to learning more about her, because I think that these things really do matter. When I applied to grad school, I went to Mills, I applied to grad school, I got into a few, but who was teaching at Mills College was Hung Lu, the iconic, Chinese American painter who I totally looked up to, and who my undergraduate mentor, Teresa Stanley, introduced me to, and it really changed my life as a student. And so when she called me, to let me know that I was accepted and she would love to work with me, I basically got off the phone, I ran screaming around my house, because it was like being called by a celebrity, and I could not believe, that I was going to be able to work with her. And so, these things really, do matter, like the idea of, mentorship and who is your mentor and who you look up with, and seeing yourself reflected, right? I'm sorry, that's really long.
Amazing.
Long response.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I would love to share some of your newer work.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, fun. Oh my gosh. Can you tell everyone a little bit about Burned? This was in Burned, Women in Fire.
Yeah, sure. I would love to. So this show, it was at Turner Carroll Gallery and curated by Tanya Turner, who's the director of the gallery. So she has had 2 shows that I've been part of, and they each come in March. And she's used the shows to really curate a small group of female artists, right, who are working in a theme. And so she, if you all go to the website, and this in 2020, after this talk, she has a really wonderful writing that describes the show, and it's where she's thinking about the act of fire in these artist processes. And for me, that act of fire was actually taking my silk and burning the edges, right? And so, but this was also really relevant work. So this was new work that I was embarking upon, and it's actually responding in some ways to the work I just showed you, where I was not really mindfully not depicting like any kind of figure, and now I am. And so what these are is responding to Orientalist paintings. So the white yellow bodies that are really flattened out, they are figures taken from historic Orientalist paintings that were, that depicted these representations of women in the East. So the East, as Edward Said's East being like, Asia, Africa, the Middle East, for instance, in very submissive and sexualized positions. And what I'm doing is I'm taking them out of there, out of that context, and I'm putting them in my own context. And so in some ways I'm flattening them out in a way where their racialized depiction is no longer there, and they are more empowered, for instance, right? So in my work, I'm recasting them, I'm giving them agency, they're weaponized, they're engaging in acts of self-love. And it's really my idea that visually flattening them out in sketchy oil paint can really examine how a gesture can refer to and reject oppressive epistemologies. And so, in my idea, I'm referring to these historic paintings created for and by the Western male lens to acknowledge the real harm that perpetuating these mythologies of history have had. And they exist, to this day, as we can see from, the media and just responses all over the country. And so in this work, I have these figures, that the figure that is a little bit more, that looks a little bit more flesh toned. That's actually Annie Mae Wong, who was an early, the earliest Asian American, she was Chinese American actress, and who was also like a staunch feminist in her day, in her own way. And I also have textile designs here that I've painted both on silk and on in oil. And the textile designs, I'm also referring to, I didn't mention this before, but sometimes there are textile designs that are historic, that are maybe more ornamental. But the ones on the bottom left here, that there's also textile designs that are scenic, and these scenic textile designs show in some ways Orientalist ideas, or there's early textile designs that actually show colonization, like scenes of colonization, for instance. And so I'm also referring to those.
Is there significance to burning silk?
Yeah, I mean, and this is one of those studio things, right? That this is a sort of like what I was referring to before, how the act of creating really, and so, it develops with sort of the intellectual act of the work. So I'm forgetting what year it was, but I was able to receive a grant, and I believe this could have been the year I got the North Carolina Artist Grant. It also, I also received a grant from the Institute of the Arts and Humanities at UNC. But so it enabled me to go to Vietnam to research silk. So I was really interested in sort of the origin of Vietnamese silk, for instance, and just origin of silk, in Vietnam, but also in Asia. And it was actually a really wonderful trip. So I went there with my colleague and dear friend, Hong An Jung, who had a show there with Huong Ngo, who's her collaborator, so we had this wonderful trip there where they had a show and I was doing research. And it was really difficult for me to find authentic silk. Was really interesting, because most of the silk I was in Hanoi, was like a blend of poly and it was just really fine. It was just really hard to find the authentic stuff. And so we know some really wonderful artists who have been really embedded in the art scene in Vietnam for a long time. And so they hooked me up with a man who was like a fourth generation silk maker. And so I went to his house and he was talking about, how to find authentic silk. And he was saying, well, you burn it, because if it has poly in the blend, it'll melt. And if you burn it, it's like almost like burning hair, right? And so for me, that was really fascinating. And it just became also just thinking about fire and the history of fire, how fire has been used to the burning of witches and how to authenticate identity. I mean, there was so much metaphor in there for my own use, but it became a way for me to also bring the aesthetic in. So some of that edge is seen, but it was also a way for me just to also finish the silk edge too. So yeah.
Oh, I love it. I want to show some more of your work. And is this is from Burned as well?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And what's going on in this work?
Yeah, so it's the same. so same series. So kind of how I was talking about, you know, where the bodies are coming from Orientalist paintings. And you know, the for me, you know, the bodies are all embracing each other. They're engaging in acts of self-love. There is some, you know, acts of maybe violence. You know, there are some remnants of historical violence with like the fingers kind of attaching to like,
Yeah.
you know, broken, you know, sawed off hands. And then there's also scenes of, so this textile design is the triumph of Spain in America, which was, it was like where you see kind of like the bluish areas. So that was a flattening out of my rendition of this historic American textile design that showed the colonization of America.
And then you sent me two others.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so these are
so beautiful.
Thanks. So, you know, these happened. So I only sent you these in progress shots that are detailed because they are actually in progress. So these were big paintings. They were 6x8 foot paintings that were that I had to stop working on because of the pandemic. But this is where this was sort of taking the paintings that were in burn and sort of starting to morph and evolve the work. So here, the bodies are still here, kind of the bodies I'm painting in pale yellow from Orientalist paintings. But what I'm doing here is I have printed these historical textile designs now on silk itself, and I'm collaging them to create. So I'm doing that, and I'm also painting on them, and I cut those up and collage them to create sort of like this kind of anamorphic organic form that becomes body-like. And so the Orientalist forms are actually kind of supporting and holding these sort of like figures that are taking shape, right? And so it's also a mindful reference to the idea that our histories are part of who we are, right? And that we're born from that, and we evolve out and emerge out of that.
It's beautiful. And there's one more.
Yeah.
Let's see. Can you tell us about this one?
Yeah, so this one, so it's just part of it, right? But the landscape in the back is actually a landscape in the Philippines, you know, that America bombed during World War II. And so, and that's where, which was really bizarre because I was painting this, and you know, there's the gas mask, you know, which for me was a reference to World War II, but then the pandemic happened, so it was really bizarre, a really interesting correlation of time. And then here's the same sort of thing, right, where you have the body from the white yellow body from the Orientalist paintings that's more flattened out. Although what's really, you know, I think you can see it a little bit more here. It's not just completely flat. Like I do have like a gesture from my hand. And what I found, you know, for myself, this is just my perception of it. When I looked at it, there was something really mysterious about the figure in painting it this way, because there's a little bit of the facial gesture just from the gesture of the oil paints, but it's just enough to make it a little mysterious, so you're not quite sure what she is doing, like what her expression is, if she's like thinking or angry or feeling love. You know, it's like really kind of hard to read her facial expression. And then you have the body here. Again, this kind of sort of body that's kind of taking form, made from both the historic textile design and painted silk that I'm collaging.
Thank you so much. I would love to open it up for people to ask questions. And if you'd like, everyone turn your videos back on. I'll stop the screen share and then we can see your faces. So if you have a question, you can type it in the chat, or if you'd like to ask it, you can do that too.
It's great to see so many people here.
Yeah.
No, it's great. Aw. Well, thank you. Nice to see your chat.
So does anybody have a question that they would like to ask?
I just want to say, Hung, thank you for also sharing the interwoven globe. So that's the wonderful book and also exhibition that was at the Met.
I had to look at my bookshelf because I also always forget the title of it. But here's the book. It's massive,
Oh.
but it was such a beautiful exhibition. And I know so many artists that have been influenced by it that are not necessarily textile artists. So I'm so glad you brought it up.
So I just want to say, so can I introduce you? So that is a wonderful.
This is not about me.
She's a wonderful friend and colleague, and she's also in this amazing. We'll just shout out. She's in an amazing exhibition right now with Hung An Jung. Can you just say the title and where it's at, Hung?
It's in Chicago and it's called Citizen versus Alien.
Yeah, so please go and check it out. And they had an amazing performance I attended a couple days ago. Thanks for being here, Hung.
It's so nice to hear all about your work because I've seen so much of your work, and of course we've hung out and everything, but I haven't heard some of these kind of influences and ideas. So nice to hear.
Yeah, great.
Thank you. Thank you. September has a question. She
Sure.
says, have you considered working on just silk on a large scale? Any
Oh.
benefits or limitations?
Yeah. So I can't see who it is, but I'll just respond. Oh, yeah, I see that now. So I actually have plans. Thank you for the question, September. I have plans to just make silk paintings, but they're not large scale. So I do have plans for a new body of work, and I'm really looking forward to my thumb brace being off, hopefully next week or so. But so I can't really talk about it because it's really just new and I haven't actually physically made it yet, but it will be only silk. And there's a reason for that. And so it'll be up and coming, and hopefully I'll be sharing stuff on social media in the next couple of months as I develop it.
So everybody go follow her on social media. We're all going to be just waiting.
Yes, I will. I promise to also post my failures, including any progress I make.
So we have a lot of gratitude. Michael says, this is such a wonderful presentation. Thank you all for being here.
Michael, thank you. And Michael Carroll is also part of Turner Carroll Gallery with his wife, Tanya. Thank you so much, Michael, for being here.
Emily says, aside from your thumb, what is the biggest challenge in making right now?
Emily, thank you, Emily. Well, Emily was my advisee from UNC. She just graduated last spring. Well, as you can imagine, being there, the challenges is time also, teaching right now, it takes a lot longer because we're virtual. Having my beautiful, amazing son at home, who is also learning remotely, is also just a challenge with time. I'm so thankful to be with my family, but time is definitely an issue. And also, Emily, as you know, my big studio is also no longer with me right now because it's undergoing renovation. So I do have a smaller studio at Haynes, and I've made so that's the part of it. But also my work, thankfully, that I'm planning, that September was asking about, coming up is going to be smaller. So thankfully there's that. So I think that once my thumb issue is resolved, I will be able to have a working a studio weekly, sessions again. So thanks for asking.
Oh, here's another one. Okay.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit about the issues of racial injustice in your paintings and the historical symbolism in your paintings? I know you've addressed it a bit, but as a painter in the American South, ooh, that's great. How does that impact your paintings?
Yeah. Thank you
Michael.
so much for the question, Michael. It's amazing. I was thinking about this actually a few years ago. I was talking to a friend and ex-colleague, Gina Valentine, who's now at SAIC with Hung, who used to be at UNC, about this. Moving to the South, really, a few things happened. Moving to the South, I think, changed my perspective from being in Northern California. And that is that my work, I think, has always dealt with social injustice and sort of looking at histories that sort of form our belief systems that perpetuate that. But coming to the South made me really think more about the systems of heritage. And I really think the idea of monuments, such as Silent Sam, which is probably what Michael Carroll's referring to, which is the Confederate monument that everyone at UNC and also it's been on national news, was taken down by activists here a couple of years ago, and just how those, and so for me, it really made me recognize and cement in my practice how I wanted to respond to that, to these cultural artifacts, art artifacts, right? Which, and you also talked about this, a bit too. They become systems of heritage in a way, these cultural artifacts of heritage. And so for myself, I'm actually, a lot of my practice is responding to that within art history, but it's also in that way that is also creating my own aesthetic, right? In response to that. So it's really kind of intertwined. I hope that I think that addresses maybe what Michael is talking about. I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
Any more questions? Thank you all so much for being here. Oh, here's another one. Nope.
Okay.
Oh, no, it's just a thanks.
Okay, thanks, Michael.
Thank you all for being here. This is such a joy to be here with our community and to get to talk to Leanne about her work. And hopefully we'll get the green light to open soon so you can come see her work in person, because PowerPoint just does not do it justice. Thank you for being with us today. We're recording this, so it will be up in about a week, so you can watch it again if you'd like. And please join us next month. We're actually going to be talking with Margie Worthington for our member conversation, who is the artist who painted the work that was on our right side of Leanne's work in the She Persists Gallery. So.
Great. I just want to thank you so much for inviting me to do this. And thank you, everyone, for being here too. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be part of this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Everyone have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.